Thomas Cromwell was one of the most remarkable statesmen in English history, a figure whose influence shaped the nation's destiny during the turbulent reign of King Henry VIII. Rising from humble beginnings, Cromwell transformed himself from the son of a brewer, known for brawls and rough living, into one of the most brilliant and powerful men in England. His legal acumen, sharp mind, and pragmatic character allowed him to rise quickly through the ranks, becoming Henry's chief secretary and ultimately the Earl of Essex. Cromwell's contributions to his king and country were pivotal, including being the mastermind behind the English Reformation. His role in engineering the king's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, allowing Henry to marry Anne Boleyn, set in motion the dramatic religious and political upheavals that followed. However, it was his involvement in arranging Henry's ill-fated marriage to Anne of Cleves that led to his downfall. The marriage, which ended in a swift annulment, tarnished Cromwell's reputation and led to his execution on the charges of treason and heresy in the year 1540. The politics of Tudor England could easily end in death with one misstep. Cromwell's reputation was also one of a brutal enforcer to a tyrannical king. Some have described him as an ambitious, ruthless, and corrupt politician who cared nothing of the policy he implemented as long as it made him rich. Despite his tragic end, Cromwell's legacy as a methodical, loyal, and intelligent administrator remains. He was the king's most faithful servant, diligently working to strengthen the monarchy, even as his master, known for his cruelty, turned on him. Henry VIII, prone to paranoia, had Cromwell executed for securing a marriage he found distasteful. Yet, after Cromwell's death, the king reportedly regretted his decision, acknowledging that he had lost his most capable minister at the height of his reign. This is the story of Thomas Cromwell, King Henry VIII's most faithful servant. Thomas Cromwell's early life remains shrouded in mystery, with few records to illuminate his family and upbringing. Born in the year 1485 in Putney, a village in Surrey then serving as a ferry crossing on the Thames, Cromwell hailed from modest beginnings. His father Walter ran a brewery and was notorious for minor legal infractions, including watering down his ale and grazing his animals on common land. Despite frequent fines for brawling and other misdemeanors, Walter was a shrewd businessman, ultimately acquiring land, lending money, and acting as a guarantor for others seeking credit. Details about Cromwell's mother remain sparse, though she is believed to have come from a respectable gentry family, a class of landowners in Britain. Cromwell was likely the youngest of 3 children, with 2 older sisters. No records exist of his early education, leaving it uncertain whether he attended school or undertook an apprenticeship. By the turn of the century, Cromwell left his family behind in Putney and ventured across the Channel to continental Europe. The reasons for his departure remain unclear, though some accounts suggest a troubled youth, with Cromwell later admitting to having been a ruffian. Allegedly, he joined the French army as a mercenary and fought in the Battle of Garigliano in the year 1503, a disastrous defeat for the French. Surviving the battle, Cromwell spent time in Italy, where he may have entered the service of the Frescobaldi family, wealthy bankers from Florence. Some stories even claim that the young Francesco Frescobaldi saved Cromwell from starvation on the streets of Florence, though this tale seems dubious. Cromwell's time in Italy likely expanded his horizons. He worked as a cloth merchant in the Low Countries, where he associated with English merchant adventurers, building important connections that would prove useful in his future career. Cromwell, known for his amazing memory, was already likely fluent in French and Italian, with proficiency in Latin and some knowledge of ancient Greek, further enhancing his education and skills. After spending years abroad, he returned to England and in the year 1515 married Elizabeth Wicks, a widow from a prosperous clothier family. Together, the couple had 3 children, though tragedy struck in the year 1529 when Elizabeth passed away. Soon after, his daughters Anne and Grace succumbed to a deadly plague, possibly the sweating sickness, a mysterious and highly contagious illness that had ravaged England and Europe for decades. By the year 1520, Cromwell had firmly established himself in London's financial and legal circles, building his reputation as a sharp and capable lawyer. In the year 1523, he was elected to Parliament, where his growing interest in church reform began to take shape. His legal expertise and tenacity soon caught the eye of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor and one of the most powerful men in England. In the year 1530, Cromwell's rise reached new heights as he was appointed to the King's Council. It was here that his true political skill would be tested. Wolsey, who had failed to secure an annulment for King Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, found himself in disgrace. As the cardinal's influence waned, Cromwell seized the opportunity, becoming the king's principal agent in solving the great matter, the issue of Henry's desperate quest for a divorce and a male heir. Cromwell's strategic brilliance soon became apparent as he turned to Parliament to push for a resolution. In the year 1532, he helped craft the Act of Restraint of Annulment, which limited the church payments to Rome, further weakening the papacy's hold on England. The following year, the Act of Restraint of Appeals was passed, declaring that the English monarch was the supreme authority in all legal matters, both secular and ecclesiastical, rendering the Pope powerless in English affairs. This bold move set the stage for the most momentous decision in English history. Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, thus securing his long-sought annulment and allowing him to marry his love Anne Boleyn. Thus began the English Reformation, a monumental shift in both the religious and political landscape of Europe, with Thomas Cromwell at its heart. Sir Thomas More, once a trusted confidant of King Henry and the Lord Chancellor of England, stood as a resolute figure against the tide of change sweeping through the country. Fiercely devoted to the Catholic faith, More rejected the Protestant Reformation and, more notably, refused to accept Henry's self-proclaimed supremacy over the Church of England. His refusal to swear the oath of supremacy, which recognised the king as the head of the church, led to his arrest and charges of treason, based on fabricated evidence. More was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where the king's forces hoped to break his unwavering resolve. Yet, after a year of confinement, More remained steadfast in his beliefs, refusing to give in. His trial for treason at Westminster Hall, however, proved to be a legal challenge. English law required a clear denial of the act of supremacy for a conviction of treason, and More's silence on the matter made his guilt difficult to prove. In a sinister turn of events, Thomas Cromwell, now the king's chief minister, manipulated the trial with the perjury of Sir Richard Rich, the Solicitor General. Rich falsely claimed that More had spoken against the act of supremacy while in the Tower. With this fabricated testimony, More was condemned to death. On the 6th of July in the year 1535, Sir Thomas More was executed, his defiance forever cementing his place in history as a martyr for the Catholic faith. In the wake of More's death, Cromwell's influence grew immeasurably as King Henry VIII's principal secretary and chief minister. Cromwell was now the architect of Henry's ambitious reforms. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun with religious and theological changes, now took a more drastic turn, as Henry sought to consolidate power over both church and state. One of the most far-reaching moves of this period was the dissolution of the monasteries. The bill which abolished England's monastic institutions was presented by Henry to Parliament and was quickly passed. The monasteries, once powerful and wealthy institutions, were systematically dismantled, their lands and assets redistributed to the crown and those loyal to the king. Cromwell, who oversaw the process, is often remembered as the driving force behind the dissolution. Though he had initially hoped for reforms within the monasteries, rather than their complete destruction, it was Cromwell who managed the details of the operation, sending inspectors to assess the wealth of over 800 monasteries across England and Wales. But the dissolution project was created by England's Lord Chancellor, Thomas Audley, who was also a prestigious barrister. Nevertheless, Cromwell is widely remembered for carrying it out. The wealth of these institutions was staggering. The monasteries owned more than a quarter of England's cultivated land, and their vast reserves of wealth were seen as a direct challenge to the king's authority. Henry, in need of funds to support his lavish lifestyle and expensive wars, found the dissolution an ideal way to both acquire wealth and break the power of the Catholic Church in England. By the late 1530s, the dissolution was in full force. Monastic properties were seized, their land sold off to wealthy families who supported Henry's break from Rome, and by 1540, the monasteries were being dismantled at a rate of 50 per month. The abbeys, which were once centres of learning and piety, were destroyed, their buildings left in ruin. Many precious manuscripts and illuminated texts, including the chronicles of the history of England, were lost forever. The destruction was not without cost. Monks, friars, and nuns were displaced, many receiving pensions, though some of the more defiant abbots and religious leaders were executed. Thousands of monastic servants found themselves destitute, their livelihoods stripped away in the wake of Cromwell's reforms. The dissolution had profound economic and cultural impacts. The king's treasury swelled with the proceeds of monastic land and riches, which amounted to an estimate £1.5 million, though much of this wealth was soon depleted by Henry's wars with France and Scotland. But the destruction was not only financial. The cultural and historical loss was incalculable. Priceless libraries, medieval manuscripts, and sacred relics were scattered to the winds, and many of England's ancient tombs, including those of forgotten Anglo-Saxon kings, were lost in the rubble of ruined abbeys. Thomas Cromwell, used as the instrument of this destruction, would forever be blamed for the loss of these ancient traditions, a dark chapter in the story of England's transformation under Henry VIII. Cromwell, ever the calculating and ambitious figure, played a pivotal role in the dramatic downfall of Anne Boleyn. While the king and his queen initially shared moments of affection, Anne's sharp intellect, political savvy, and assertive qualities admired in a mistress proved intolerable in a wife. By Christmas of the year 1534, after Anne suffered a stillbirth or miscarriage, Henry began discussing with Cromwell the possibility of divorcing her without returning to Catherine of Aragon. Although this plan was temporarily set aside, Anne's miscarriage, combined with tensions surrounding the court, marked the beginning of her unravelling. After Anne's emotional outburst upon discovering Jane Seymour, Henry's new favourite, seated on his lap, the royal marriage began to disintegrate. Anne's recovery from the miscarriage was soon overshadowed by Henry's declaration that he had been deceived into marrying her, claiming that either by deception or spells she had manipulated him. Cromwell, ever attentive to the political winds, recognised that Anne had become a threat to his ambitions. Her disputes over the redistribution of church revenues and foreign policy, where she supported a French alliance while Cromwell favoured an imperial one, fueled the growing tension between them. Cromwell sought to restore the king's finances and solidify his own power, while Anne's ideas on both matters undermined his position. Historians debate the extent of Cromwell's role in Anne's downfall. Some, like Anne's biographer Eric Ives, argue that Cromwell orchestrated her fall, using the political differences as a pretext to remove her from power. Others, such as Cromwell's biographer, John Schofield, suggests that Cromwell's involvement in Anne's downfall was not conspiratorial, but rather a consequence of Henry's orders. Regardless of the nature of Cromwell's involvement, it was Henry's desire for a new queen, combined with his shifting political priorities, that set the stage for Anne's destruction. On the 2nd of May in the year 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, her once powerful position shattered. Initially hysterical, she demanded to know the charges against her and the whereabouts of her father and brother. She was accused of treason, charged with conspiring to bring about the king's death, and adultery, charges that shocked the court. Despite the lack of credible evidence, Anne was found guilty and sentenced to death. On the 19th of May in the year 1536, she was executed by beheading, a tragic end orchestrated by the forces of power and ambition, with Cromwell playing a decisive, if controversial, role in her downfall. Jane Seymour ascended to the role of Queen Consort. However, her time as queen was tragically brief. Barely 2 weeks after giving birth to her only child, the future King Edward VI, she succumbed to postnatal complications. She was the only wife of Henry to receive a queen's funeral, a reflection to the love she earned during her brief time as queen. Her death, however, left Henry in a precarious situation. Though he had finally secured a male heir, his legacy remained uncertain. His line was fragile, and the need for another marriage was unavoidable. The king was reluctant to marry again, still grieving the loss of his beloved Jane, but his advisors, led by the ambitious Cromwell, reminded him that England's future rested on strengthening the royal line and securing a stable dynasty. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, argued that Henry's next marriage must be one of pure political necessity, aimed at strengthening the nation's position. But Henry was adamant he would not simply marry any foreign princess. She had to meet several criteria. She must be young, capable of bearing children, gentle in temperament, and above all, she had to be beautiful. Cromwell suggested Anne of Cleves, a German princess with significant diplomatic advantages. The eldest daughter of John, Duke of Cleves, came from a powerful and strategically important family in the Holy Roman Empire. The match, orchestrated by Cromwell, was seen as a way to secure Protestant alliances against the Catholic powers of France and Spain, who posed a growing threat to England's ambitions. To help Henry make his decision, Cromwell commissioned the renowned artist Hans Holbein the Younger to paint portraits of Anne and her sister. Holbein, tasked with a precise and unflattering likeness, produced a portrait of Anne that was so striking in its elegance and grace that Henry, upon seeing it, was immediately taken with her. He felt drawn to meet the woman in person. By March of the year 1539, the marriage negotiations were in full swing, and a treaty was signed in October of that year, sealing the fateful alliance. However, when Henry finally met Anne in person, his initial enthusiasm quickly soured. The woman before him did not resemble the radiant image captured in Holbein's painting. In fact, Henry is reported to have muttered, "I like her not," upon first encountering Anne in Rochester. His disappointment was visible, and the marriage, despite his reservations, proceeded. Some historians argue that Henry's misgivings about the marriage were because of Anne's unsatisfactory appearance. The king, who had been led to believe that Anne was a beauty beyond compare, felt deceived. It is said he found it impossible to consummate the marriage, unable to feel any desire for a woman whom he found so unattractive. In wake of this frustration, Henry turned his ire on Cromwell. The portrait that had once seemed a perfect representation of Anne now appeared as a gross misrepresentation, and Cromwell found himself blamed for the king's dissatisfaction. Henry demanded that his advisor find a legal way to annul the marriage, but by this point, the alliance with the German duchy was so important that any attempt to break it off would jeopardize England's diplomatic position. Thus, despite his personal discontent, Henry was forced to endure a marriage that was never consummated, while Cromwell, once his trusted servant, became the target of the king's rage. King Henry, in a moment of vulnerability, confided in his trusted advisor Thomas Cromwell, revealing his deepest shame. He had been unable to consummate his marriage with Anne of Cleves. Henry, humiliated by the failure of this union, gave Cromwell permission to share this delicate information with William Fitzwilliam, the first Earl of Southampton. William, as Lord High Admiral, had played a key role in escorting Anne from Calais to England, and now he would be privy to the king's embarrassment. At the same time, Cromwell, still grappling with the implications of this unforeseen crisis, confided in his principal secretary, Thomas Wriothesley, a man who also served the king in several vital capacities. Cromwell was uncertain how to navigate the potential scandal about to unfold. The truth of Henry's humiliation, though sensitive, inevitably leaked beyond the confines of Cromwell's inner circle. William, eager to avoid the king's wrath for his role in bringing Anne to London, was quick to protect himself. Some historians speculate that Thomas Wriothesley's close associate Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London, may have played a part in ensuring that Cromwell would bear the brunt of the blame for the marriage's failure. All three men in Cromwell's inner circle proved to be fragile and self-serving, essentially throwing Cromwell to the wolves. As Cromwell's reputation faltered, a significant shift in foreign policy further undermined his standing. A long-anticipated Franco-Imperial alliance had failed to materialise. This diplomatic setback was compounded by the news that the Duke of Norfolk had been sent on a mission to France to offer Henry support in his ongoing dispute with Emperor Charles V. This mission had been met with a favourable response from King Francis I, a development that tipped the balance of power in England's favour and cast doubt on Cromwell's earlier foreign policy strategy. Cromwell had pursued an alliance with the Duchy of Cleves, a move that now appeared misguided and damaging, especially in the wake of the king's marital misfortune. Moreover, the possibility of war loomed large, with rising tensions between the Duke of Cleves and Emperor Charles V. Should a conflict erupt between these two powers, Henry would be caught in a difficult position. His alliance with Cleves would likely force him to declare war on France, a stark reversal of his previous foreign policy, and an outcome that would be politically disastrous. The failure of Cromwell's foreign policy, coupled with his faltering domestic influence, set the stage for his eventual downfall, as his enemies within the court began to circle, ready to take advantage of his weakened position. In the early months of 1540, Thomas Cromwell's enemies, primarily the conservative aristocratic faction led by the Duke of Norfolk and bolstered by the cunning Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, began to consolidate their power against the reform-minded minister. This group, alarmed by what they saw in the country's drift towards radicalism in matters of religion, seized upon the opportunity to challenge Cromwell's influence. Their opposition was particularly motivated by the growing unease over the religious shifts, which had been vigorously debated in Parliament that spring. Norfolk and Gardiner, both deeply conservative in their religious beliefs, feared that England was moving too far from the traditional Catholic doctrine under Cromwell's guidance. Their plan to unseat Cromwell took shape around a young woman, Catherine Howard, Norfolk's niece. The Duke, ever the opportunist, saw in Catherine a means to rid himself of his political rival. With the help of Stephen, Norfolk orchestrated Catherine's rise, carefully positioning her in Henry VIII's path as a potential new wife. As Catherine's relationship with the king began to blossom, orchestrated all with subtlety and intention, Norfolk and Gardiner found themselves steadily inching back into positions of power, their ambitions fueled by the potential of Catherine replacing Anne of Cleves as queen. For Cromwell, the situation was fraught with danger. While it would have been a relatively simple matter for him to arrange an annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne, who was compliant and docile, doing so would have created even more of a perilous predicament. To annul the marriage would open the way for Catherine to marry Henry, thus securing his enemy's power while further diminishing his own influence. Yet, Henry, although surely tempted by his feelings for Catherine, hesitated to move swiftly against Cromwell. Cromwell was in the midst of navigating two critical pieces of legislation through Parliament: the Subsidy Bill, which would expand the power of the Crown to levy taxes for general government purposes rather than for specific objectives, and a bill to seize the assets of the Order of St. John. Both measures were controversial, and Henry, ever wary of public discontent, feared that any backlash would fall squarely on Cromwell's shoulders, sparing the king himself from blame. However, by June the 10th of the year 1540, the tide had irrevocably turned against Cromwell. He was arrested during a council meeting at Westminster, accused of various charges, many of which were politically motivated. The arrest, while framed as a punishment for Cromwell's role in promoting religious reformation, was undoubtedly also a response to the disaster of his latest marital arrangement with Anne of Cleves. The king's personal humiliation over this marriage was an added blow to Cromwell's standing at court. His enemies, eager to see him fall, wasted no time in seizing every opportunity to degrade him. The Duke of Norfolk, in a gesture of palpable disdain, ripped the St. George's collar, the insignia of the Order of the Garter, from Cromwell's shoulders, declaring, "A traitor must not wear it." Cromwell's reaction was initially one of defiance. He famously said, "This is my reward for faithful service?" He boldly challenged his fellow councillors to label him a traitor, unwilling to accept the injustice of the moment. He was taken to the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned, the once powerful minister now a prisoner. Thomas Cromwell was condemned to death on the 28th of July in the year 1540, a tragic fate sealed without trial. In a swift and brutal stroke, he lost all his titles, wealth, and property. The king, who had once relied upon him so heavily, now saw no value in the man who had helped shape his reign. On that fateful day, Cromwell was publicly beheaded on Tower Hill, an execution that mirrored the ultimate betrayal of the man who had served King Henry with unmatched loyalty. His head, severed from his body, was impaled on a spike on London Bridge, displayed for all to see as a grim reminder of the swift cruelty of Tudor politics. The very day of his execution, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard to further insult Cromwell's memory. In the years that followed Cromwell's death, Henry came to deeply regret the hasty and misguided execution of his former minister. The king, ever quick to point the finger of blame, accused his other ministers of orchestrating Cromwell's downfall through pretexts and false accusations. Henry soon realised that Cromwell had been the most faithful and capable servant he had ever known. Without him, the royal administration faltered, and the government struggled to maintain its earlier levels of efficiency and control. Cromwell's rise from humble beginnings to become the king's right hand was nothing short of extraordinary. From a self-described ruffian in his youth to a skilled lawyer, his life was an epic saga of adventure, hard work and audacity. Yet in the cutthroat world of Tudor England, where politics were often murderous and betrayal was a constant threat, Cromwell's success made him many enemies. Ultimately, his ability to navigate the dangerous currents of Tudor politics was both his greatest strength and his eventual undoing. Cromwell's death marked the end of a brilliant political career, but it also signalled the loss of a man who had, for a time, been indispensable to the success and stability of Henry VIII's reign. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and I'll see you all soon for another History Profile.